Okay, my name's Dan Akins, and now we're going to talk about Fregoli Syndrome, aka the Fregoli delusion, which Ramachandran mentions briefly toward the end of chapter 8. Now, earlier in the chapter, Ramachandran mentions Capgras syndrome, which might sound similar, but it's actually different from Fregoli. So, with Capgras, a familiar person, say a parent, is recognized physically but believed to be an unknown imposter. Now, with Fregoli, it's kind of the opposite. Strangers or casual acquaintances are believed to be familiar persons, people who are emotionally close, longstanding acquaintances, or even celebrities in disguise. So Ramachandran's example is you're walking down the street and nearly every woman you see looks like your mother in disguise, or every young man seems to be your brother in disguise. But this is actually just one of four possible iterations of the syndrome that have been described. Um, Now, Fregoli syndrome is the rarest of the delusional misidentification syndromes. It was actually named after the late 19th century Italian actor Leopoldo Fregoli, who was a quick change artist, famous for his ability to switch characters so unbelievably quickly that he had to invite journalists backstage at his shows to quell rumors that he was using other actors to con the audience. Now, Ramachandran hypothesized that Fregoli patients may have an excess of temporolimbic connections between the facial recognition centers and the amygdala, which would imbue every face with familiarity, while he suspected that Capgras might be due to an underactivation of those connections. And now, this explanation has actually been called into question for two reasons. One, multiple Fregoli cases exist involving one-to-one mappings, in which one real person is mistaken for one different known person. So, if Ramachandran's hypothesis were correct, we would expect to see continual misidentifications because those areas are just overstimulated all the time. Um, Simultaneous Capgras and Fregoli cases have also been documented. So, if Ramachandran's hypothesis were correct, this would likely not occur because you couldn't have underactivation and underactivation at the same time. So, a different model has been proposed, which speculates that the problem lies not in the temporolimbic connections, but in the connections between the facial recognition units and the person identity nodes in the fusiform gyrus. Now, this explanation is more plausible, but there's little to no neurophysiological research available on the subject. So, Ramachandran also wonders if racial stereotypes might be attributed to the model that he described to try to explain the Fregoli-like occurrences. Referring back to that temporolimbic model. So he imagines that an unpleasant encounter with a member of a particular visual category might become associated with all members of that category, such that it's difficult for the higher brain centers to correct. So, looking at that, a systematic review of fMRI studies from 2012 identified several regions commonly identified are commonly involved with racial stereotyping. So one study found that people were faster and more accurate identifying faces from members within their own racial group than from outside of it. This indicates perhaps that the ability to distinguish between races influenced by the fusiform gyrus. Now, studies also found variability in amygdala reactivity across individuals and groups, suggesting that amygdala activity reflects the mind of the individual perceiver more than objective differences in perceptual stimuli. Now, we're not sure exactly how this happens, but it does imply even greater interactive complexity across brain systems. Now, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex serves as a monitor for competing responses. And if a conflict's found, it attempts to exert control by activating the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Now, studies found that the stronger the amygdala response, the stronger the anterior cingulate cortex response, which indicates greater inner conflict. And then, so the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex then serves as a sort of filter whose job it is to actually implement control to regulate our emotional response. And a series of studies found that white Americans with more negative attitudes towards blacks performed worse on a Stroop test after interactions with black people than after interactions with white people, which leads researchers to speculate that this may have resulted from a depletion of cognitive resources in an effort to monitor and control their inner conflict during the interracial interaction. So, while Ramachandran's hypothesis about Fregoli syndrome may have been incorrect, current evidence would support its application to racial stereotyping.